3 months ago, I had a $5.2 million Silicon Valley estate and a perfect family. Today, I am standing in a dead woman's basement, clutching proof that my 45 years of life were just a staged experiment. The spouse who took everything from me in court was actually trying to save me from a reality far worse than death. Listen closely, because what I found here will make you doubt everyone you sleep next to. My name is Christopher Williams. If you had Googled me 6 months ago, the search results would have painted a portrait of the American dream personified. You would have seen a 45-year-old senior risk assessment officer at Vanguard Trust, a man whose signature was required to approve billion-dollar mergers in the steel and tech industries. You would have seen photos from the annual charity galas in San Francisco, where I stood in a tuxedo with my arm around Elena, my wife, of 20 years, looking like we owned the world. You would have seen a man who lived by logic, by numbers, by the cold, hard certainty of cause and effect. I was the guy companies hired to tell them where the cracks in their foundations were before the whole building came down. It is the ultimate irony of my life that while I was busy predicting market crashes and corporate espionage for Fortune 500 companies, I failed to see that the floorboards in my own home were rotting away inch by inch, right beneath my feet. My life was a fortress. Or at least I thought it was. We lived in a $5.2 million estate in Silicon Valley, a place with manicured hedges and a security system that cost more than my father's first house. I had everything a man is supposed to want. Julian, my 17-year-old son, was captain of his debate team and had his eyes set on Stanford. Skylar, my 15-year-old daughter, played the violin with a haunting precision that made grown men weep. And then there was Elena. Beautiful, poised, intelligent Elena. She was the anchor, the one who managed the social calendar, the one who navigated the cutthroat world of neighborhood associations and charity boards with a grace that I could never replicate. The collapse did not happen all at once. It was not an explosion, at least not at first. It was a slow, creeping erosion. It started with the dinners. Elena had recently become involved in high-end real estate consulting, or so she told me. It seemed harmless enough. She said she needed something for herself, something outside of being Mrs. Christopher Williams. I supported her. I encouraged her. Then came the late nights. It began on a Tuesday in early November. She said she had a closing dinner with a client from Dubai. I remember looking at the clock on the microwave. It was 1 a.m. Then it was 2 a.m. When she finally walked through the door at 3:15, she did not smell like a business dinner. She smelled of cold air and expensive, unfamiliar cologne. But when I asked, she smiled that perfect practice smile and told me I was being paranoid. She said the client was demanding that the deal was worth 6 figures in commission. I let it go. I was a risk assessor, but I was also a husband who wanted to trust his wife. That was my first mistake. The financial bleed was the next sign, but it was subtle enough that a less meticulous man might have missed it. I handle millions of dollars daily at work, so I have a habit of checking my personal accounts with the same scrutiny. One evening, while sitting in my study with a glass of scotch, I logged into our joint savings account. The balance was lower than I remembered. Not empty, just lower. I clicked on the transaction history. There were withdrawals. $9,000 here, $4,000 there. They were labeled as consulting expenses or asset management fees. I frowned, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my glasses. I called Elena into the room. She didn't even blink. She told me she was investing in a private equity fund for her real estate group, that the returns would be 20% within 6 months. She touched my shoulder, her fingers cool, and told me to stop treating our marriage like a Vanguard audit. I felt a twinge of guilt. I closed the laptop. That was my second mistake. The end of my world arrived on a rainy Thursday night, and it came with the force of a freight train. It was 11:30 at night. The house was quiet. Julian and Skylar were asleep upstairs. I was in the living room reading a report on emerging markets in Southeast Asia. The rain was hammering against the floor-to-ceiling windows, a rhythmic drumming that usually helped me focus. Then the rhythm was broken. Boom, boom, boom. The front door shook so violently I thought the wood would splinter. Before I could even stand up, the sound of glass shattering echoed through the foyer. "Federal agents, police! Get on the ground, now!" The voices were screaming, overlapping a cacophony of aggression that made no sense in my quiet gated community. Men in tactical gear swarmed into my living room like a colony of black ants. The beams of their flashlights blinded me, cutting through the dim ambition of the room. I was thrown to the floor, my face pressed against the cold hardwood. I felt a knee in my back, the weight of a grown man crushing the air out of my lungs. "Christopher Williams, you are under arrest." "For what?" I gasped, tasting dust and fear. "I'm a banker. You have the wrong house." "You have the right to remain silent," a voice barked near my ear as cold, metal cuffs bit into my wrists. I was hauled to my feet. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked up toward the staircase. Julian and Skylar were standing at the railing, their faces pale eyes wide with terror. Julian was holding Skylar, whose hands were over her mouth. "Dad!" Julian's voice cracked. "Dad, what's happening?" "It's a mistake, Julian," I shouted, trying to sound authoritative despite the handcuffs. "Stay with your sister. It is just a mistake." But then I saw Elena. She was standing at the top of the stairs, a few feet away from the children. She wasn't crying. She wasn't screaming. She was wearing her silk robe, her arms crossed over her chest. She looked down at me, not with fear, but with a detached curiosity, as if she were watching a news report about a stranger. Our eyes met for a second, and the emptiness in hers sent a chill through me that was colder than the rain outside. The lead agent, a man with a buzz cut and a scar running through his left eyebrow, shoved a warrant in my face. "We have a warrant to search the premises for evidence of money laundering, wire fraud, and conspiracy to distribute narcotics." "Narcotics?" I laughed, a hysterical, breathless sound. "I assess financial risk. I don't touch drugs. Check my records." "We did," the agent said grimly. "That is exactly why we are here." They tore my house apart. They emptied drawers, ripped paintings off the walls, and seized every electronic device we owned. But the real nightmare began when they sat me down at my own dining table and opened a laptop I had never seen before. "Recognize this?" the agent asked. "No," I said. "We found it taped under the desk in your study. It is encrypted, but we have the key. We found that in your nightstand." He turned the screen towards me. It was a ledger. A digital ledger showing transfers of millions of dollars moving from shell companies in Mexico to accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. And authorizing every single transaction was my digital signature, my unique Vanguard Trust encryption key. The one that only I was supposed to have access to. The one I kept on a biometric drive in my office safe. "This is impossible," I whispered, the blood draining from my face. "I didn't do this. That signature is mine, but I didn't sign these." "We have emails, Mr. Williams," the agent said, his voice dripping with disgust. "Emails from this IP address sent at 3 a.m, coordinating drops. We have bank records showing deposits into accounts under your name." "I don't have those accounts," I shouted. "We found the passbooks in your golf bag," he countered. I sat there, stunned into silence. It was a frame-up. It had to be. But it was not just a frame-up. It was a masterpiece. Someone had not just planted evidence. They had woven a completely alternate reality into the fabric of my life. They had used my credentials, my habits, my hiding spots. The police were dragging me out the door when Elena finally came downstairs. The children were crying now, sobbing into each other's shoulders, but Elena walked past them without a word. She walked right up to me as the officers held me by the arms. I looked at her, searching for some sign of support, some sign that she knew this was insanity. Elena, call the lawyer. Call heavy hitters. You know I didn't do this." She stopped 2 feet in front of me. The flashing red and blue lights from the cruisers outside danced across her face, illuminating her sharp features. She reached into the pocket of her robe and pulled out a white envelope. "Christopher," she said. Her voice was steady, void of any tremor. "I cannot have this in my house. I cannot have a criminal around my children." "I am not a criminal," I pleaded. "Elena, look at me. It is me. Chris." She didn't blink. She tucked the envelope into the pocket of my jacket. "These are divorce papers. My lawyer drafted them this morning. I want you out of our lives. I want full custody. And given the circumstances, I don't think you will have much of a leg to stand on." This morning, the words hit me harder than the accusations. "You drafted them this morning before the police even got here." She leaned in close, so close, I could smell that same unfamiliar cologne she had worn weeks ago. But this time, she didn't whisper a reassurance. She whispered a death sentence. "You were careless, Chris. You thought you were the smartest man in the room. You never even looked at who was holding the door for you." She pulled back and looked at the officers. "Get him out of here. He is upsetting the children." As they shoved me into the back of the squad car, I watched through the window. I saw my neighbors standing on their lawns, phones raised, recording my humiliation. I saw the sleek black branding of the Vanguard Trust legal team pulling up not to defend me, but to distance themselves. I knew what was happening before my phone even buzzed in my pocket, which had already been confiscated. I was suspended, pending investigation, in the corporate world that is code for dead and buried. I looked back at the house one last time, the $5.2 million fortress. Elena was standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the warm light of the hallway. She wasn't watching me leave. She was already closing the door. That night, I sat in a holding cell in downtown San Francisco, surrounded by drunks and petty thieves. I was Christopher Williams, the man who could predict the collapse of economies. But sitting on that cold metal bench, realizing that my bank accounts were frozen, my reputation was incinerated, and my wife had handed me divorce papers hours before my arrest, I realized I had failed the most important assessment of all. My life had been a lie. And the architect of my destruction was the woman I had slept beside for 20 years. The empire of Christopher Williams had not just fallen. It had been demolished brick by brick from the inside out, and I was the only one left in the rubble. The San Mateo County Superior Court smelled of floor wax and desperate prayers. It was a sterile, windowless box designed to strip away human dignity under the guise of justice. I sat at the defendant's table wearing a suit that felt 2 sizes too big for me now. In just 3 weeks, the stress had carved 10 pounds of flesh from my frame. My hands were folded on the table, not to look composed, but to hide the tremors that I could not control. To my right sat a public defender named Mr. Henderson, a man who smelled of stale coffee and defeat. He had looked at my case file for perhaps 20 minutes before we walked in. To my left across the aisle sat the executioner. Elena looked radiant. That is the only word for it. She wore a modest navy blue dress that screamed maternal sacrifice. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, highlighting her high cheekbones and the tragic tear-stained redness around her eyes. It was a masterpiece of makeup artistry. She looked like the brave survivor of a war I did not know I was fighting. Next to her was Arthur Sterling, a divorce attorney, whose billboards littered Highway 1. Sterling was a shark in a $3,000 custom suit, and he was smiling. But the knife in my heart was not Elena. It was behind her. Julian and Skylar sat in the front row of the gallery. I turned my head, desperate to catch their eyes, to send some silent signal of love, of reassurance. Julian, my 17-year-old boy, who used to ask me for advice on tie knots, and girls refused to lift his head. He was staring at his shoes as if they were the most fascinating things in the world. And Skylar. My sweet 15-year-old Skylar. She was trembling. When I shifted in my chair, she flinched. She actually pulled her knees up to her chest and looked away, terror etched into her features. It was as if I were a monster from a nightmare, not the father who had taught her how to ride a bike and held her when she cried over a broken violin string. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed. Judge Margaret Halloway entered. She was a woman with a face like chiseled granite and eyes that had seen too many lies to have any patience left. She sat down, adjusted her glasses, and looked at me with a mixture of pity and disgust. "We are here to determine the temporary custody arrangements and the status of marital assets in the matter of Williams versus Williams," Judge Halloway said. Her voice was dry like autumn leaves scraping against pavement. Sterling stood up. He didn't just stand. He unfolded himself like a predator rising from the deep. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth and carrying a practiced gravity. "We are not just asking for full custody. We are asking for an immediate restraining order. The children are terrified. The events of the past month have revealed a side of Mr. Williams that my client has hidden for years to protect the family's reputation. But after the federal raid, she can no longer stay silent." "Objection," Henderson mumbled half-heartedly next to me. "Speculation." "Sustained. Stick to the facts, Mr. Sterling," the judge said, though she didn't look away from me. "The facts, Your Honor," Sterling said, picking up a thick binder. "Exhibit A, medical records from Dr. Eris Thorne, a psychiatrist. Mr. Williams visited secretly 3 years ago." I blinked. "I never saw a psychiatrist named Thorne," I whispered to Henderson. "That is a lie." Henderson just scribbled on his notepad. "Let him finish," Sterling continued. "These notes detail a diagnosis of intermittent explosive disorder and narcissistic personality traits. Mr. Williams admitted to fantasies of violence against his family. He admitted to controlling the finances, to keep his wife and children in a state of dependency. And here, he pulled out a photo, is a picture taken by Mrs. Williams 2 months ago, showing bruising on Julian's arm after an altercation with his father." I stood up. I couldn't help it. The chair screeched against the floor. "That is a lie. Julian fell during soccer practice. I was the one who put ice on it. Elena, tell them the truth." "Sit down, Mr. Williams." Judge Halloway slammed her gavel. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. "He is lying!" I shouted, pointing a shaking finger at Sterling. "I never hit my kids, never!" Skylar let out a sob. A loud, ragged sound that tore through the courtroom. Elena wrapped her arm around her daughter, pulling her close, looking at the judge with wide, fearful eyes. "Please," Elena mouthed silently. That was it. That was the nail in the coffin. My outburst had just proved everything Sterling had said. I was the angry, unstable man. I was the ticking time bomb. I sank back into my chair, the energy draining out of me so fast I felt dizzy. I looked at Julian. He was crying now, too. Silent tears running down his face. What had she told them? What kind of poison had she dripped into their ears, night after night, to make them look at me like this? The rest of the hearing was a blur of legal jargon that sounded like a funeral dirge. My career at Vanguard Trust was used against me. My ability to assess risk was painted as a sociopathic trait. The frozen accounts were presented not as a tragedy, but as proof of my illicit activities. Finally, Judge Halloway delivered the verdict. Based on the evidence presented and the visible distress of the children in the presence of the father, I am granting full, temporary custody to Mrs. Williams. Mr. Williams is to have no contact with the children or Mrs. Williams until the conclusion of the criminal investigation. Furthermore, due to the federal freeze on the assets, the court cannot release funds to Mr. Williams at this time. The marital home and all associated accounts remain seized. She looked at me one last time. "Mr. Williams, I suggest you find help, for your own sake." The gavel banged. It was over. In less than 2 hours, my life had been legally dismantled. I walked out of the courtroom in a daze. The hallway was crowded with people, but I felt completely alone. I was a ghost, a pariah. I had no home to go to, no money in my pocket except for $200 in cash I had managed to hide in my shoe before the arrest. No job. And now, no family. I leaned against the cold marble wall near the elevators, trying to remember how to breathe. The air felt thin. The double doors of the courtroom opened. Elena walked out flanked by Sterling and the children. She guided Julian and Skylar toward the exit, handing them off to her sister, who was waiting by the stairs. She whispered something to them, kissed their foreheads, and sent them away. They didn't look back at me, not once. Elena turned and walked toward me. Sterling lingered a few feet behind, checking his watch, looking bored. She stopped right in front of me. The weeping victim mask was gone. The fear was gone. Her face was smooth, composed, and utterly blank. It was the face of a statue. "Why?" I rasped, my voice broken. "Elena, why the money? Okay, take the money, but the kids, why make them hate me?" She stepped closer. She smelled of lavender and ice. She leaned in until her lips were almost brushing my ear. The intimacy of the gesture was sickening. "Christopher," she whispered. Her voice was not the voice of the woman I had married. It was lower, devoid of any warmth. "You were never the player. You were just a pawn. A utility piece on a board you cannot even see." I pulled back, staring at her. "What are you talking about?" She smiled. It wasn't a smile of joy. It was a small, tight curvature of the lips that didn't reach her eyes. It was the smile of a devil admiring its handiwork. "Your usefulness has expired," she said softly. "The project is moving to the next phase. Do not look for us. Do not try to find the children. If you do, the police will be the least of your problems. Disappear, Christopher. It is the only kindness I will offer you." She turned on her heel and walked away. Her heels clicked rhythmically on the marble floor. Click, click, click. The sound of a countdown ending. I staggered out of the courthouse and into the blinding California sun. The world was too bright, too loud. Cars were honking, people were laughing. Life was going on, indifferent to the fact that mine had just ended. I walked for hours. I didn't know where I was going. I found myself standing on a pedestrian bridge overlooking the freeway. The cars below rushed by at 70 miles per hour. A blur of metal and speed. It would be so easy. Just one step. One jump. The pain would stop. The confusion would stop. The look in Skylar's eyes, that terrified, flinching look, would stop haunting me. I gripped the railing. My knuckles turned white. I leaned forward, the wind whipping my tie against my face. "You are a pawn," her words echoed in my skull. If I jumped, she won. If I jumped, the lie became the truth forever. I stepped back. I sat down on the dirty concrete of the walkway and put my head in my hands. I needed a reason to breathe. I needed one single thing that was mine. And then, through the fog of despair, a memory surfaced. Not of Elena, not of the kids, but of Grandma Martha. My grandmother died 5 years ago. She was a strange, reclusive woman who lived in the backwoods of Vermont. She had never liked Elena. She had refused to come to our wedding. When she died, she left me everything, which amounted to a pile of old books and a rotting cabin in the middle of nowhere. I had never bothered to visit it. I was too busy building my empire in Silicon Valley. But I remembered the letter attached to her will. I had skimmed it and tossed it in a box of old tax returns. "Christopher," she had written in her shaky cursive. "When the world strips you naked, go to the basement. That is where the roots are." At the time, I thought it was the senile rambling of an old woman. Now it sounded like a lifeboat. The cabin. It was in Vermont. It was paid for. It was off the grid. And most importantly, it was the one asset Elena didn't know about. Or maybe she did, and she thought it was too worthless to seize. It wasn't listed on the Vanguard financial disclosure, because the deed was still technically in Martha's name, held in a trust I had never activated. I stood up. The suicidal urge was replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I wasn't going to die today. I was going to disappear just like she said. But not to fade away. To regroup. I had $200. It wasn't enough for a plane ticket, and I couldn't use my credit cards without alerting the police or Elena. I walked to a pawn shop 3 blocks from the courthouse. I sold my watch, a vintage timepiece worth $12,000 for $500 cash. The owner knew I was desperate, and he fleeced me. I didn't care. With $700 in my pocket, I went to a sketchy used car lot under the freeway overpass. I bought a 1998 sedan with rust eating away at the wheel wells and an odometer that had rolled over at least twice. It smelled of stale cigarettes and pine air freshener, but the engine turned over. I didn't go back to the house. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. I pointed the nose of that beat-up car east and drove. I drove until the Golden Gate Bridge was just a memory in the rearview mirror. I drove until the palm trees turned into desert scrub, and the desert turned into the flat expanse of the Midwest. I slept in the car at rest stops, eating peanut butter sandwiches and drinking tap water from gas station bathrooms. 5 days. It took me 5 days to cross the country. As I crossed the state line into Vermont, the weather changed. The sunny optimism of the West Coast was replaced by a gray, oppressive sky. The trees were bare, their skeletal branches reaching up like pleading hands. Snow started to fall light at first, then heavier. I navigated the winding, unpaved roads based on a map I had bought at a gas station. The GPS on my phone was off. I had ditched the phone in a trash can in Nevada to avoid being tracked. Finally, I saw it. Grandma Martha's cabin sat at the end of a long, overgrown driveway. It was a 2-story structure made of dark timber, looking like it was sinking into the earth. The windows were dark. Vines crawled up the sides like veins. It looked abandoned, desolate, and haunted. To anyone else, it would have looked like a horror movie set. But to me, as I killed the engine and sat in the sudden silence of the woods, it looked like the only sanctuary left on earth. I stepped out of the car. The cold air bit into my face, sharp and real. I didn't have a key, but I remembered Martha always hid a spare inside a fake rock near the porch steps. I fell to my knees digging through the snow and dead leaves until my fingers brushed against cold plastic. I found the rock. I found the key. I walked up the creaking steps and unlocked the heavy oak door. It swung open with a groan that echoed through the silent forest. The air inside was stale, smelling of dust and old paper. I stepped across the threshold and closed the door behind me, locking out the world that had rejected me. I was alone. I had no money, no wife, no children, and no name. I was in the belly of the beast now. Or perhaps the womb. "Okay, Grandma," I whispered into the darkness, my breath pluming in the freezing air. "I am here. I am naked. Now, show me the roots." I didn't know it then, but standing in that hallway was the easy part. The real horror wasn't what I had left behind in California. It was waiting for me right beneath my feet. The silence in the cabin was not peaceful. It was heavy like a woolen blanket soaked in ice water. I stood in the center of the living room, my breath visible in the frigid air, listening to the house settle around me. The wooden beams groaned under the weight of the snow piling up on the roof, a sound that mimicked footsteps so closely that I found myself spinning around hands, raised in defense, expecting to see a police officer or a hitman standing in the shadows. But there was nothing, just dust motes dancing in the slivers of gray light cutting through the heavy curtains. I had not set foot in this house in over 20 years, not since the summer of 2005, right before I started my MBA program and met Elena. Back then, this place had felt suffocating. It was too quiet, too remote, too disconnected from the fast-paced world I was desperate to conquer. Now, looking at the peeling wallpaper and the moth-eaten rug, I realized it was the only place on earth that did not want to arrest me or erase me. My grandmother Martha had been a woman of few words, and even fewer smiles. She was not the type of grandmother who baked cookies or knitted sweaters. She was the type of grandmother who taught me how to walk silently in the woods and how to spot a lie by watching a person's pupils. As a child, I thought she was just eccentric, a lonely widow living out her days in the boondocks of Vermont. But standing here now, with the eyes of a man who had just been framed by a sophisticated criminal conspiracy, the house looked different. It looked like a fortress. I walked to the front door, the one I had just entered. It was thick, oak solid, and heavy, but when I examined the frame, I saw the steel reinforcement plates bolted into the jambs. They were painted brown to blend in with the wood, but they were industrial grade. I checked the windows. They were double-paned, which was normal for Vermont winters, but the locking mechanisms were excessive. Each window had 3 separate latches, and there were screw holes where heavy iron bars could be mounted in seconds. I remembered the evenings I spent here as a boy. Martha would spend hours every night pacing the perimeter of the house. "Check the locks, Christopher," she would say. Check them twice. Then check the monitors. She had a small room off the kitchen that she called her sewing room, but I never saw a needle or thread in there. I walked toward it, now, the floorboards creaking in protest. The door was unlocked. Inside, pushed against the wall, was a bank of 4 old CRT monitors, the kind with bulging glass screens that hummed when you turned them on. They were dark now, covered in a thick layer of dust. I wiped the screen of the center monitor with my sleeve. It was connected to a closed-circuit camera system. Why did a 70-year-old retired librarian need a surveillance system that covered all 4 corners of her property in the middle of the woods? A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature crawled up my spine. I had spent my life assessing risk for billion-dollar corporations, yet I had missed the anomalies in my own bloodline. The sun began to set, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floor. The loneliness hit me then, a physical blow to the gut. I sat down on a dust-sheeted armchair and stared at the empty fireplace. I had no wife. I had no children. I had no name. The Christopher Williams who commanded respect in boardrooms was dead. I was just a fugitive in a dead woman's bunker. Hunger gnawed at my stomach, reminding me that I was still human. I needed money. The $700 I had left would buy food and gas for maybe 2 weeks if I was careful. After that, I would starve. My only option was to sell this place. It was a teardown, but the land had to be worth something. Maybe $50,000. Maybe $80,000. Enough to hire a lawyer who wasn't afraid of Vanguard Trust. Enough to fight for Julian and Skylar. The thought of my children galvanized me. I couldn't sit here feeling sorry for myself. I needed to get this house ready for an appraisal. I started the next morning at dawn. I found a broom and some old rags in the utility closet and began the Herculean task of cleaning 20 years of neglect. I started in the guest bedroom, the room that had been mine during those long, boring summers. It was exactly as I had left it. A single twin bed with a quilt that smelled of cedar. A small desk. A bookshelf filled with Hardy Boys mysteries. I opened the closet door, and a cascade of old toys tumbled out. I knelt down to pick them up. There was a tin soldier, a wooden race car, a Rubik's Cube. I picked up the race car, turning it over in my hands. A wave of nostalgia washed over me, but it was interrupted by something odd. On the bottom of the car, written in white paint, was a code, Subject 4-82. I frowned. I picked up the tin soldier. On the base, in the same meticulous handwriting, Subject 4-82. I checked the Rubik's Cube. A small sticker on the white center square read S, 4-82. Date 06/19/85, 1985. That was the year I turned 5. Why would a grandmother label her grandson's toys with subject numbers? It felt clinical, cold. It reminded me of the inventory tags we used at Vanguard for office equipment. I felt a sudden disconnect from my own memories, as if the childhood I remembered was a movie I had watched rather than a life I had lived. I tossed the toys back into the box unsettled. I needed to focus on the paperwork. If I was going to sell the house, I needed the deed, the property tax records, anything that proved ownership. I went into Martha's bedroom. It was sparse, almost monastic. A bed, a dresser, and a heavy wooden desk. I sat at the desk and began going through the drawers. They were organized with military precision. Utility bills in one folder, medical records in another. I pulled out a folder labeled Income. Martha had been a librarian at the local county branch. I expected to see a meager state pension, maybe snippets of Social Security. I opened the file and stared at the bank statements from 2010, the year before she died. Deposit $3,450. Source Heritage Logistics, LLC. Every month like clockwork. I did the math in my head. That was over $40,000 a year. For a retired librarian in rural Vermont, that was a fortune. I had never seen her spend money on anything. She wore clothes from Goodwill and ate canned soup. Where did the money go? And what was Heritage Logistics? I pulled out my burner phone, a cheap prepaid device I had bought at a truck stop in Ohio, and searched for the company name. No results found. I tried variations. Heritage Logistics, Incorporated. Heritage Transport. Heritage Holdings. Nothing. The company did not exist. Not on the public internet, anyway. A company that paid a consistent pension for decades didn't just have zero digital footprint, unless it was a shell, a front. My risk assessor brain kicked into high gear. Anomalous income streams usually meant one of two things: illegal activity or hush money. I dug deeper into the desk. In the bottom drawer, hidden under a stack of blank envelopes, I found a blueprint. It was old, the paper yellow and brittle. It was a layout of the cabin. I traced the lines with my finger. Living room, kitchen, 2 bedrooms, bathroom. But then my finger stopped. On the blueprint running underneath the living room was a large rectangular space labeled Archive. There was no basement in this house. At least not one I had ever seen. I had lived here for summers on end. There was a crawl space, sure accessed from the outside for plumbing repairs, but it was dirt and spiders. This blueprint showed a full-sized room accessible from the inside. I looked at the location of the entrance on the diagram. It was marked with a small X, right in front of the fireplace. I stood up and walked to the living room. The fireplace was a massive stone structure dominating the wall. In front of it lay a thick, dusty Persian rug that had been there for as long as I could remember. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I grabbed the edge of the rug and pulled. It was heavy, weighed down by years of grime, but I dragged it back. Underneath, the floorboards looked normal. I got down on my hands and knees, running my fingers along the grooves of the wood. The dust made me sneeze, but I ignored it. I pressed, pulled, and prodded. Nothing. I looked at the fireplace again. Martha was practical. She wouldn't create a mechanism that required magic. I looked at the brickwork. On the right side of the hearth, about 2 feet up, one brick looked slightly cleaner than the others. The soot didn't cling to it as thickly. I pressed the brick. It didn't move. I tried pulling it. Nothing. I sat back on my heels, frustrated. Think Chris. Think like her. She was paranoid. She was careful. She liked codes. I looked at the toys in the box nearby. Subject 4-8. 2. 4, 8. 2. I looked at the bricks. They weren't numbered, but they were arranged in rows. I counted up to the 4th row. I counted 8 bricks over. I pressed the 8th brick on the 4th row. Click. A distinct mechanical sound echoed from the floor. A section of the floorboards about 3 feet by 3 feet popped up an inch. It was hydraulic. I held my breath and lifted the trapdoor. It was heavy, lined with steel on the underside. Below me, a set of concrete stairs descended into darkness. The air that wafted up was not musty or damp like a root cellar. It smelled of dry paper ozone and something chemical. It smelled like an office building that had been sealed in a time capsule. I grabbed a flashlight from my toolkit and shined it down. The beam cut through the dark, revealing a space that was far larger than the footprint of the cabin above should have allowed. It was lined with shelves, and on those shelves were hundreds of wooden crates. They were identical uniform and sealed. I walked down the stairs, the concrete cold through the soles of my worn-out shoes. I reached the bottom and swept the light across the room. It was not a basement. It was a warehouse. I approached the nearest crate. It was nailed shut, the wood dark with age. On the side, stenciled in black military-style lettering, was the date October 14th, 1980. I moved to the next one, November 2nd, 1980. The next, December 5th, 1980. The room was filled with them, decades of crates. I felt a sudden irrational urge to run back upstairs to nail the trapdoor shut, to get in my car and drive until the gas ran out. Whatever was in this room was the reason Martha had 3 locks on her windows. Whatever was in this room was the reason I was standing here now, stripped of my life and my family. But I couldn't run. Curiosity is a cruel master, and desperation is even crueler. I looked around for something to pry the crate open. I found a rusty crowbar hanging on a pegboard on the far wall. I weighed it in my hand. It felt like a weapon. I walked back to the crate dated October 14th, 1980. That was the year I was born. I wedged the tip of the crowbar under the lid of the crate. The wood groaned a high-pitched screech that sounded like a scream in the silence of the underground room. I pushed down with all my weight. Crack. The lid splintered and popped open. I didn't know what I expected to find. Gold Guns drugs. I shined the flashlight inside. It was filled with video cassettes. Dozens of them. VHS tapes with handwritten labels. I picked one up. The label was faded, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was Martha's. It read, Subject 4, Month 1, Sleep Patterns and Stimuli Response. I picked up another, Subject 4, Month 3, Cognitive Development Test. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped the tape. Subject 4, the code on my toy car. I wasn't just a grandson visiting for the summer. I wasn't just a boy playing in the woods. I was the assignment. And this basement wasn't an archive of the past. It was the user manual for my entire life. The adrenaline from opening that first crate of tapes had not yet faded when I realized something was wrong. The room I was standing in, the room filled with the wooden crates dated from the 1980s, felt too exposed. It was damp. The walls were rough concrete and the air smelled of earth. It was a root cellar that had been converted into storage. But Martha was a woman of layers, a woman who reinforced her front door with steel plates. She would not leave the documentation of my entire existence in a room that could be accessed by simply popping a hydraulic latch under a fireplace brick. I turned my flashlight beam away from the crates and swept the floor. The concrete was cracked and stained, but in the far corner, tucked behind a stack of empty shelving units, lay a rug. It was not like the Persian rug upstairs. This was a heavy, rubber-backed industrial mat, the kind you see in mechanics' garages. I walked over to it. My shoes crunched on the grit. I grabbed the corner of the mat and heaved it back. Beneath it was not concrete, but steel. It was a square hatch, about 2 feet wide, painted a matte black that seemed to absorb the light from my flashlight. There was no handle. There were no hinges. There was only a small rectangular panel embedded in the center, glowing with a faint, dying amber light. It was an electronic keypad, but not a modern touchscreen. It was old technology, the kind with raised rubber buttons that looked like they belonged on a calculator from 1990. I knelt down, the cold of the steel seeping through the knees of my suit pants. A red light blinked slowly next to the keypad. Locked. I hovered my finger over the keys. It required a 4-digit code. My first thought was the obvious one. Martha's birthday. July 4th. I pressed 0704. A harsh electronic buzz echoed in the silent room. The red light blinked faster. Incorrect. I wiped the sweat from my palms onto my trousers. I tried my own birthday. October 14th, 1014 buzz. I sat back on my heels, forcing myself to breathe. The air down here was thin, and my heart was racing like a trip hammer. Why would she lock this? And what code would a woman who lived in isolation for 40 years use? I tried the year she bought the house. 1972. Buzz. I stared at the blinking light. It was mocking me. I closed my eyes and tried to summon a memory of her, anything that might give me a clue. I remembered her voice, raspy and low, telling me stories on the porch. "You are not from here, Christopher. You are from the soil, but not this soil." She never talked about my parents. She never talked about where I was born. But I had seen my birth certificate once years ago, when I was applying for my first passport. It wasn't issued in Vermont. It wasn't issued in California. It was issued in a place I had never visited. Blackwood, New Jersey. I tried to remember the area code for New Jersey. I didn't know it. But then I remembered the old phone number, written inside the cover of Martha's address book, the one she said was for emergencies only. The one that rang a deadline, the one time I tried it. It started with 609. Area code 609. My finger trembled as I reached for the keypad. 609. Pound key. There was a pause. A silence that stretched for a heartbeat. Then two. Click-clack. The sound of heavy tumblers disengaging was the loudest thing I had ever heard. The red light turned green. A hiss of pressurized air escaped from the seams of the hatch, blowing dust into my face. The steel door popped upward a few inches, assisted by hidden springs. I gripped the edge and pulled it open. If the room above was a storage cellar, the room below was a vault. I climbed down a narrow metal ladder into a space that felt like the inside of a bank safety deposit box. The air here was climate-controlled, cool and dry. The walls were lined with white, soundproof tiles. LED strip lights triggered by a motion sensor flickered to life overhead, bathing the room in a sterile, clinical white glow. There were no wooden crates here. Instead, there were rows of gray metal filing cabinets, each locked and labeled with alphanumeric codes that made no sense to me. Project H, Subject 1, Subject 2, Containment Protocols. But what drew my eye was the far wall. Embedded in the concrete was a safe. It was massive, a circular chrome door that looked like it belonged in a heist movie. But unlike the hatch, this one was already open. Just a crack. I walked toward it, my footsteps silent on the rubberized floor. I pulled the heavy door open. My breath hitched in my throat. Inside the safe, stacked in neat vacuum-sealed bricks, was money. Cash. United States dollars. I reached in and grabbed a bundle. It was a stack of $100 bills, wrapped in a paper band labeled $10,000. I counted the stacks with my eyes. There were rows of them, deep rows. I did a quick mental calculation. It was at least $1 million. $1 million in untraceable cash sitting in a hole in the ground in Vermont. But next to the money was a small metal box. I opened it. Passport. I picked up the first one. It was a dark blue American passport. I flipped it open. The photo was mine. It was a younger version of me, maybe 25 years old. But the name wasn't Christopher Williams. Name David Roach. Place of birth Seattle, Washington. I picked up the second one. Same photo. Slightly different haircut. Name Michael Vance. Place of birth Austin, Texas. There were 5 of them. 5 different identities. 5 different lives I could have lived. Or maybe 5 lives I was supposed to live. My hands were shaking so hard I dropped Michael Vance onto the floor. Who was I? Was I ever Christopher Williams? Or was that just another name printed on a government booklet, handed to me by a woman I called grandmother? I looked back into the safe. There was one last item sitting on the metal shelf alone, separated from the money and the lies. It was a VHS tape. It wasn't in a case. It was just a black cassette with a white adhesive label on the spine. The handwriting was Martha's, But it wasn't the steady, blocky print on the crates upstairs. This handwriting was shaky, hurried, as if she wrote it while looking over her shoulder. To Chris, the truth about the bloodline. I stared at the tape. This was it. This was the answer to the question that had been screaming in my head since the police kicked down my door in San Francisco. I looked around the sterile room. In the corner, sitting on a metal cart, was a small television and a VCR combination unit. It looked archaic in this high-tech room, a relic of the past. I grabbed the tape and walked over to the cart. I plugged the unit into a power strip on the wall. The screen crackled to life with a burst of static snow. I pushed the tape into the slot. The machine whirred and clicked, swallowing the plastic cassette. I pressed play. The static on the screen danced for a few seconds, erratic and noisy. Then the image stabilized. It was Martha. She was sitting in this very room. I recognized the white tiles behind her. She looked younger, her hair still peppered with black, not the pure white I remembered at her funeral. She was wearing a lab coat, not a cardigan, a white medical lab coat with a logo embroidered on the pocket that I couldn't quite make out. She looked directly into the camera lens. Her eyes were hard-focused, devoid of the grandmotherly warmth she used to fake so well. "Christopher," she said. Her voice was tinny, coming through the old speakers, but it cut through me like a knife. "If you are watching this, it means I am dead. And it means they have found you. Or you have found yourself." She paused, taking a sip of water from a glass on the table. "I need you to listen to me very carefully," she continued. "Everything you think you know about your life is a fabrication. You were not born. You were designed." I gripped the edge of the metal cart, my knuckles turning white. "The money in the safe is for you to run," she said. "But before you run, you need to know what you are running from. You need to know about the blood that runs in your veins. It is not William's blood, Christopher. It never was." The screen flickered, the tracking on the old tape losing its hold for a second, distorting her face into a grotesque smear before snapping back. "Turn off the lights, Christopher," the woman on the screen commanded, as if she could see me standing there in the cold, white glow of the bunker. "And watch the beginning of the end." The woman on the screen took a breath, a sharp intake of air that crackled through the speakers of the television. I sat on the cold metal stool, my knees pressing against the cart, mesmerized and horrified by the image of the woman I had known as Grandma Martha. She adjusted her glasses, a nervous tick I remembered from my childhood. But the eyes behind the lenses were not the eyes of the recluse who tended a garden in Vermont. They were the eyes of a scientist looking at a failed experiment. "First," Martha said, her voice steadying, "I need to absolve you of a guilt you do not even know you are carrying. You did not fail your family in San Francisco. You did not lose your mind. You are exactly what you were designed to be. And that is the problem." She leaned forward, bringing her face closer to the camera lens. "I am not your grandmother, Christopher. I never was. And the man and woman you believe to be your parents, the ones who died in that car crash when you were 2 years old, they never existed. They were paper constructs, ghosts created by a printer." I felt the blood drain from my face. I wanted to reach out and stop the tape, to smash the television and reject this madness, but my limbs felt heavy, paralyzed by the gravity of her words. "You are the property of a classified initiative known as Project Heritage," she continued. "It was funded in the late 1970s by a consortium of private equity firms and defense contractors. We called them the Council. Their goal was not to create a super soldier. That is Hollywood nonsense. They wanted something far more valuable. They wanted a super analyst, a human being with a genetic predisposition for pattern recognition, risk assessment, and predictive logic so advanced that it bordered on precognition." I stared at the screen. My entire career at Vanguard Trust flashed before my eyes. The way I could look at a spreadsheet and simply see the anomalies, The way I could predict market crashes weeks before they happened, a talent that had earned me millions of dollars, and the nickname, the Oracle, among my colleagues. I had always thought it was hard work and intuition. Martha was telling me it was engineering. You were subject 4, she said. There were 12 of you in the beginning. We sourced genetic material from donors with specific cognitive profiles. Chess grandmasters, mathematicians, cryptographers. Your biological father was a physicist at MIT who vanished in 1979. Your biological mother was a prodigy in behavioral economics who died of a sudden aneurysm the same year. They were not lovers. They were petri dishes. I gagged. A wave of nausea rolled over me, violent and sudden. I bent over, clutching my stomach, dry heaving onto the sterile floor of the bunker. I was a product. I was livestock. On the screen, Martha continued oblivious to my breakdown in the future. The project was headquartered in a facility beneath a cornfield in Nebraska. I was the lead behavioral psychologist. My job was to monitor the emotional development of the subjects. We needed you cold enough to be objective, but human enough to function in society. It was a delicate balance. But by 1982, the project was compromised. The council grew impatient. The early subjects were showing signs of instability, aggression, catatonic states. The council ordered a liquidation. They wanted to wipe the slate clean and start over with a new batch. She paused, and for the first time her voice broke. She looked away from the camera, her hand trembling, as she reached for the glass of water again. They killed them, Christopher. Subjects 1 through 3. They were toddlers, and they put them down like sick dogs. I couldn't watch it happen again. You were the youngest, you were healthy. You looked at me with those wide, intelligent eyes, and you smiled when I showed you a sequence of colored blocks. You had solved the pattern in seconds. You were perfect. I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand, tears stinging my eyes. The image of a young Martha, my Martha, saving me from execution, was the only anchor I had left in this storm. I faked the paperwork, she whispered. I swapped your file with Subject 3, who had already passed. I listed you as terminated, and then I took you. I smuggled you out in a laundry truck. I had a contingency plan, a new identity set up in Vermont, under the name Martha Williams. I created a backstory for you, a tragic accident for your parents, to explain why you were with me. I hid you in plain sight. She looked back at the camera, her expression hardening. But you need to understand something. I didn't just hide you because I loved you. I hid you because I knew they would never stop looking. And I knew that if I raised you too close, if I showed you too much affection, I would soften you. I would ruin the very intellect that made you special. That is why I was cold to you, Christopher. That is why I pushed you away. I had to let you develop your own defenses. I had to let you become the man who could survive on his own. The revelation hit me harder than the betrayal. Her distance, her strict rules, the way she forced me to solve my own problems, it wasn't neglect. It was training. She was hardening the asset to survive in the wild. I monitored you, she admitted, even after you left for college, even when you moved to San Francisco. I had taps on your phone. I hacked into your medical records. I needed to make sure the genetic defects that claimed the others didn't manifest in you. And I needed to make sure the council hadn't found you. She leaned back in her chair, the lab coat rustling. For 40 years we were safe. But I am old Christopher, and I know my time is running out. That is why I built this bunker. That is why I hoarded the cash. Because I know how the council thinks. They don't just want their investment back. They want the yield. The yield, I whispered to the empty room. They believe that the subject reaches peak cognitive maturity between the ages of 40 and 50, Martha explained, as if answering me. That is when the brain's processing power aligns perfectly with experience. That is when you become the ultimate weapon in financial warfare. If you are watching this, it means they have made their move. They haven't killed you, have they? No. They wouldn't kill the goose that lays the golden eggs. They want to corner you. They want to strip you of your resources, your support system, your credibility. They want to make you desperate. My hands clenched into fists. The frozen bank accounts. The ruined reputation. The divorce. It wasn't just punishment. It was a herding technique when they were steering me. They want you to come to them, Martha said. They want you to have nowhere else to turn. They will offer you a deal, a way to get your life back, a job, a purpose. And once you sign that contract, once you step back into their world, you will never leave. They will hook you up to their machines, and they will drain every ounce of genius from your mind until you are a husk. The screen flickered again. The video was nearing its end. Martha stood up and walked toward the camera. Her face filled the screen, every wrinkle, every pore visible in the grainy footage. You have a choice, Christopher. You can let them take you. You can go back to being a lab rat. Or you can use the gift they gave you to burn them to the ground. The money in the safe is clean. The passports are high-quality forgeries created by a contact I trusted in the 80s. But the most dangerous weapon in this room is not the cash. It is you. She reached out as if to touch my face through the glass. Project Heritage was a failure because they underestimated the human variable. They didn't account for the soul. You have a soul, Christopher. I made sure of that. Do not let them take it. Her eyes narrowed, and for a second, she looked terrifyingly fierce. If they have taken your assets, if they have turned your wife against you, if they have taken your children, then the extraction team is already on its way. They know you will come here. It is the only property linked to your past. You have very little time. Run, she said. Run and don't stop running until you have figured out how to kill the beast that created you. I love you, my boy. I always did. The screen cut to black, then to static. The loud, rhythmic hiss of the white noise filled the sterile room, drowning out the sound of my own breathing. I sat there for a long time, staring at the gray fuzz. I wasn't Christopher Williams. I was a 45-year-old biological experiment. My memories of parents were implanted lies. My grandmother was my handler. My wife got Elena. I thought about the timeline. Martha said the council monitored me. She said they would strip me of my support system. Elena. The realization came slow and cold like a glacier moving through my mind. Elena hadn't just turned on me. Elena had been placed. I stood up, pacing the small room. I looked at the passports again. David Roach, Michael Vance. If I took the money and ran, I would survive. I could disappear into South America or Southeast Asia. I could live out my days as a wealthy ghost. But then, I thought of Skylar's face in the courtroom. The terror in her eyes. Project Heritage was genetic. The thought stopped me dead in my tracks. If I was a carrier, if my genetics were so valuable that a shadow organization would kill to control them, then what about my children, Julian, Skylar? They weren't just my kids. To the council, they were the second generation. They were the refined iteration. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. Martha hadn't mentioned the children. Maybe she didn't know. Or maybe she knew, and she was too afraid to tell me. If the council was coming for me, they already had Julian and Skylar. The custody battle wasn't about protecting them from an unstable father. It was about securing the assets, the biological assets. I looked at the black screen of the television. "You are wrong, Grandma," I whispered. "I can't run." I walked over to the safe and grabbed the stack of cash. I stuffed the bundles into the pockets of my oversized suit jacket until the fabric strained. I grabbed the passport for Michael Vance. It seemed as good a name as any. Then I turned to the filing cabinets. Project H. I needed to know more. I needed to know who they were. I needed names, locations, weaknesses. I grabbed the handle of the cabinet labeled Administrative/Personnel and yanked it open. Inside were files dating back to 1980. I flipped through them frantically. Pay stubs, requisition forms, internal memos. And then I saw it. A personnel file from 2005, the year I met Elena. I pulled the file out. The name on the tab was not Elena. It was Agent 794. I opened it. A photo of a young woman stared back at me. It was Elena. She looked younger, fresher, but the eyes were the same. Cold, calculating. Attached to the file was a mission directive. Target Subject 4. Objective Infiltration Monitoring and Reproductive Cultivation. Reproductive Cultivation. I slammed the file shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the small room. They had bred me. They had used Elena to extract the genetic material and create the next generation. My marriage was a petri dish. My children were the harvest. I felt a rage so pure, so white-hot that it burned away the fear. It burned away the confusion. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a weapon. Martha was right. They had designed me to see the patterns, to predict the outcomes, to destroy the risks. Well, I had just assessed the risk. And the only way to save my children was to liquidate the shareholders. I was about to turn back to the ladder when a sound from upstairs froze the blood in my veins. It was faint, muffled by the layers of steel and concrete, but unmistakable to ears that had just been told they were genetically engineered for awareness. Crunch, crunch, footsteps on the snow, heavy boots, and not just one pair. Click, the sound of the front door lock being picked. Martha's warning had been literal. If they took your assets, the hunt has begun. They weren't just coming. They were here. I looked at the trapdoor above me. It was the only way out, or was it? I scanned the room. A bunker like this, built by a paranoid genius, wouldn't have just one exit. I looked at the far wall behind the filing cabinets. There was a slight discoloration in the concrete, a seam. I ran to it. I pushed against the filing cabinet, my muscles screaming as I shoved the heavy metal unit aside. Behind it was a tunnel. A narrow, dark crawl space that smelled of damp earth and escape. Above me, I heard the heavy thud of boots entering the living room. They were walking right over my head. "Clear the perimeter," a voice, muffled by the floorboards, commanded. "Secure the package. If he resists, neutralize him, but keep the brain intact." I grabbed the bag of money, took one last look at the room that held the ashes of my identity, and crawled into the darkness of the tunnel. The Christopher Williams who entered this house was dead. The man who was crawling through the dirt was something else entirely. Something much more dangerous. Subject 4 was awake, and he was angry. The tunnel was a claustrophobic nightmare of damp earth and rotting wood. I crawled on my hands and knees, the jagged stones tearing through the fabric of my suit, trousers biting into my skin. In one hand, I gripped the flashlight, its beam cutting a shaky path through the darkness. In the other, I clutched the heavy plastic folder labeled Agent 794 and the bag of cash. Behind me, the muffled sounds of heavy boots on floorboards faded, replaced by the rhythmic rasp of my own breathing and the scuttling of insects disturbed by my intrusion. I did not know where the tunnel led, but Martha had built it, so I knew it led away from the kill zone. After what felt like an eternity, the air shifted. It became colder, fresher. The smell of ozone and damp earth was replaced by the scent of pine needles and snow. I saw a grate ahead, obscured by dead vines. I kicked it open, the rusted hinges giving way with a screech that sounded too loud in the silent forest. I tumbled out into the snow, gasping for air. I was in a ravine, perhaps 300 yards from the cabin. The house was visible through the trees, its windows glowing with a warm, inviting light that belied the violence happening inside. I saw shadows moving past the curtains. The extraction team. They were tearing the place apart, looking for me. I scrambled up the bank of the ravine and found shelter under the overhang of a massive, fallen oak tree. It was a temporary hideout, but it offered cover from the wind and the prying eyes of the men in my grandmother's house. My hands were numb, my body shaking from adrenaline and hypothermia, but my mind was on fire. I turned on the flashlight, shielding the beam with my jacket to avoid detection, and opened the file. Agent 794, The photo clipped to the inside cover was not the Elena I knew. It was not the smiling woman in a wedding dress, nor the weeping mother in the courtroom. It was a mugshot-style photo of a 20-year-old woman with dead eyes and a jaw set in grim determination. Name Elena Vance. Codename The Shepherd. Status Level 5, Administrator. Assignment Subject 4, Long-Term Stabilization and Monitoring. I stared at the name, Vance. The same last name as one of the fake passports Martha had left for me, Michael Vance. She wasn't just my wife. She was my cover, my handler, my jailer. I flipped the page. It was a report dated September 12, 2005, the day we met. Incident report contact established. Method calculated collision. University Library, West Wing. Subject reaction. High receptivity. Subject displayed immediate physiological arousal and protective instincts upon target dropping books. Notes. The emotional hook has been set. Subject is lonely and seeking an intellectual equal. I have mirrored his interests in classical music and macroeconomics to accelerate bonding. Probability of cohabitation within 6 months, 98%. I felt a bile rise in my throat. I remembered that day. I remembered the clumsiness, the laughter, the way the sunlight caught her hair as we picked up her scattered textbooks. I had told myself it was fate. I had told our children it was the most romantic moment of my life. It was a math problem. It was a script written in a boardroom before I had even put on my shoes that morning. I turned the pages, my fingers leaving dirty smudges on the pristine white paper. The file was a chronicle of my life, but viewed through the lens of a lab technician observing a rat. January 15, 2010. Subject is experiencing elevated stress due to market volatility. Sleep patterns disrupted. Administered mild sedative via evening tea. Subject slept 8 hours. Cortisol levels normalized. July 4, 2014. Subject expressed desire to move to Europe. Request denied. I have subtly manipulated his career trajectory to keep him anchored in the Bay Area, within the primary containment zone. I utilized emotional guilt regarding his aging grandmother, whom he believes he is neglecting to enforce compliance. She had drugged me. She had manipulated my career. She had used my love for Martha, who was also in on it, to keep me on the leash. But the worst part was the psychological profiles. Monthly reports detailing my fears, my insecurities, my sexual preferences. Subject responds positively to validation of his intellect. Subject requires a dominant maternal figure disguised as a partner. I have adjusted my persona to provide 90% support and 10% criticism to maintain his need for approval. "You monster," I whispered, the steam from my breath clouding the air. "You absolute monster." The love was fake. The arguments were fake. The intimacy was data entry. I thought of the nights I held her whispering my darkest secrets, thinking I was safe. I was just reading my diary to a spy. I skipped to the end of the file. The recent documents. The ones that explained why my life had been incinerated. Directive Recall, Protocol Alpha. Date, January 1st, 2026. Objective: dismantle Subject 4's external support structures to force a return to the primary facility. Strategy: isolate Subject. Sever financial independence. Remove biological offspring to secure leverage. Character assassination, required to prevent Subject from seeking legal recourse or public sympathy. Notes from Agent 794. I have initiated the divorce proceedings. The asset seizure is complete. The fabricated evidence regarding money laundering has been planted on his encrypted drive. Subject is currently in a state of high distress. He has been stripped of his ego, his fortune, and his family. He is cornered. Prediction. He will retreat to the Vermont safe house within 7 days. Extraction team should be on standby. She did it. She did all of it. The police raid the humiliating court hearing the lies about my violence toward Julian. It wasn't just a bad divorce. It was a hurting maneuver. She was the sheepdog biting at my heels to drive me back into the pen. I leaned my head back against the rough bark of the oak tree, looking up at the black sky through the branches. The betrayal was so total, it felt physical, like a hollow ache in the center of my chest. I had grieved the loss of my marriage for weeks, but there was no marriage to grieve. It was a 20-year undercover operation. I looked back down at the file, my eyes blurring with tears of rage. I wanted to kill her. I wanted to find her and wrap my hands around her throat and squeeze until the calm, calculating mask shattered. But as I went to close the folder, a piece of paper slipped out. It was a photocopy of a court document, the asset forfeiture list. I had seen this document in the courtroom. It listed everything I owned: the house in Silicon Valley, the cars, the stocks, the retirement accounts. Everything had been checked off, valued, and frozen. But I looked closer at the bottom of the list. Item: rural property, 312 Old Mill Road, Vermont. Status: exempt. Note: property deemed derelict/hazardous. No commercial value. Ownership unclear due to probate issues. Omitted from seizure order. I frowned. Elena was a level 5 administrator. She was a woman who noticed a 2-point fluctuation in my blood pressure. She was a woman who had planned our accidental meeting in a library down to the angle of the sun. She didn't make mistakes, and she knew the Vermont house wasn't derelict. She knew it was the fallback point. The file I just read explicitly stated, prediction: he will retreat to the Vermont safe house. If she knew I was coming here and if she wanted the organization to capture me, she would have ensured the house was seized, monitored, or surrounded before I got here. But she had listed it as exempt. She had told the court, and by extension the public record, that it was worthless and not worth watching. Why, I looked at the date on the directive again. January 1st. Then I looked at a handwritten note in the margin of her report, scrawled in blue ink. It was her handwriting, but it was messy, jagged. Unlike the precise typing of the report. He needs a door. Do not seal the basement. My heart skipped a beat. Who was that note for? It wasn't in the official report sent to the council. It was on her personal copy, a reminder to herself. Or a message she hoped I would find. I thought about the timeline. She destroyed my life. She took the kids. She painted me as a monster. But she left me the car keys, figuratively speaking. She left the Vermont house untouched. She pushed me out of San Francisco, away from the eyes of Vanguard Trust, and funneled me to the one place where I could find the truth about my origins. If she hadn't destroyed my reputation, I would have stayed and fought in the courts. I would have been arrested and put in a federal prison where the council could have easily extracted me. By ruining me, she made me run. And by making me run to Vermont, she led me to the bunker, to the money, to the truth. I looked at the house again. The men inside were moving from room to room. They were methodical. They were killers. If Elena was fully loyal to them, she would have given them the key code to the hatch. She would have told them exactly where to look. But they were searching. They were breaking things. They didn't know the layout. She hadn't told them about the bunker. A strange, twisted hope began to take root in the ashes of my hate. Was it possible? Was it possible that the woman who spent 20 years pretending to love me had actually, somewhere along the way, started to feel it? Or was this just another layer of the manipulation? Was she giving me a head start, just to make the hunt more interesting? I looked at the mugshot of Agent 794. Her eyes were cold. But I remembered the courtroom, the moment she whispered in my ear, "You are just a pawn. Disappear, Christopher." At the time, I thought it was a threat. Now, hearing it in my head again, it sounded different. Disappear. She wasn't telling me to get lost. She was giving me an order. She was telling me to go dark, to escape the game board. I shoved the papers back into the folder. I didn't know if she was a savior or a sociopath. Maybe she was both. But one thing was clear. She had played a dangerous game with her masters to give me a fighting chance. And she had the children. If she was betraying the council, then Julian and Skylar might still be safe. She might be shielding them, just like she was shielding me. But if she was caught, I checked the load in the pistol I had found in the safe, a matte, black 9mm that felt heavy and cold in my hand. I had never fired a gun in my life. But I was a quick learner. My file said so. I wasn't going to run to South America, not yet. I needed to talk to the enemy. I needed to know whose side Agent 794 was really on. I crawled out from under the oak tree, clutching the bag of money and the file. I moved deeper into the woods away from the house, toward the old logging road where I had hidden the rust bucket car. The Christopher Williams who believed in fairy tales was dead. The Christopher Williams who believed in justice was dead. The man walking into the darkness was something new. I was the variable they hadn't accounted for, and I was going to find out if my wife was the lock or the key. I sat in the frozen driver's seat of the rusted sedan, the engine idling rough and loud in the silence of the old logging road. My breath fogged the windows, creating a cocoon of ice and anxiety. I was 3 miles from the cabin, deep enough in the woods that the extraction team wouldn't hear the car, but close enough that I felt their presence like a phantom limb. I had the money. I had the gun. I had the file that proved my marriage was a 20-year intelligence operation. But I didn't have a plan. The burner phone I had bought in Ohio buzzed in my pocket. I ignored it. It was probably a telemarketer or a wrong number. Then a different sound cut through the air, a shrill mechanical ringtone that didn't come from my pocket. It came from the bag of money on the passenger seat. I froze. I stared at the canvas bag. The ringing persisted, muffled by layers of $100 bills. I reached over and unzipped the bag. Buried beneath a stack of cash wrapped in blue bands was a satellite phone. It was old brick heavy, with a stubby black antenna. Martha must have put it there, or someone else. I picked it up. The screen glowed green, displaying a single word: Gatekeeper. I didn't want to answer. Every instinct I had screamed that this was a triangulation signal. But if they put the phone in the bag, they already knew where the bag was. They knew where I was. I pressed the green button and held the heavy plastic against my ear. "Christopher," a voice said. It wasn't robotic or disguised. It was smooth, cultured, and male. It sounded like a board member inviting me to a golf outing. "You are proving to be remarkably resilient. Most subjects in your cohort would have catatonic by now." "Who is this?" I asked, my voice raspier than I intended. "You can call me the Gatekeeper," the voice replied. "I am the one holding the leash you have been trying to chew through for 45 years. "If you want the money, come and get it," I said, gripping the steering wheel. "But bring body bags. I'm not the same man who walked out of that courtroom." The Gatekeeper laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Oh, Christopher, do not be tedious. The money is irrelevant. That $1 million is a rounding error in our petty cash fund. We let Martha keep it to give you a sense of agency. A rat runs faster when it thinks it sees a hole in the maze." My stomach tightened. "Then what do you want?" "We want the source code," he said. I frowned. "I don't know what you are talking about. I'm a risk assessor, not a programmer." "Do not play coy. 3 months ago at Vanguard Trust, you developed a heuristic algorithm to predict sovereign debt defaults in emerging markets. You called it the Omega Model. We call it the source code. It is not just a financial tool, Christopher. It is a predictive engine based on your unique cognitive architecture. It predicts human behavior on a macro scale. It predicts chaos." I remembered the model. It was a side project, a complex formula I had doodled on a napkin during a boring meeting and then refined late at night. It worked perfectly, too perfectly. I had archived it on the company server because the results terrified me. That model is theoretical, I lied. It is evolutionary, the gatekeeper corrected. And you are the only one who holds the encryption key to unlock the full dataset. We tried to crack it after we seized your servers. But you clever boy, you tied the decryption to a biometric sequence that only you can input. So that is what this is about, I shouted, losing my cool. You destroyed my life for a password. We destroyed your life to motivate you to give it to us. But we seem to have reached an impasse. You are running. We are chasing. It is inefficient. So let us change the incentives. There was a pause on the line. Then a sound that stopped my heart. It was the sound of a violin. A few shaky, terrified notes of a Bach partita. Skylar, I whispered. The music stopped abruptly. She has excellent form, the gatekeeper said. And Julian, he is quite the debater. He argued very passionately that his father was innocent. It was touching. If you touch them, I snarled, a guttural sound rising from my chest. I will burn everything down. I will go to the press. I will go to the FBI. The FBI works for us, Christopher. The press prints what we tell them. And as for hurting them, no. We would never damage the merchandise. Julian and Skylar are carriers. They have your genes. They are candidates for Project Heritage Phase 2. If you do not deliver the source code to us within 24 hours, they will not be harmed. They will simply be enrolled. They will be taken to the facility in Nebraska. Their memories will be wiped. Their identities will be erased. And they will become Subject 5 and Subject 6. The world tilted on its axis. My children, my babies. Lab rats in a cage just like I had been. Just like my parents had been. You have 24 hours, the gatekeeper said. Bring the encryption key to the cabin. We will be waiting. If you are late, the enrollment process begins. And trust me, the memory wipe is unpleasant. The line went dead. I stared at the phone in my hand, my vision blurring with red rage. I wanted to scream. I wanted to drive the car into a tree. But the panic lasted only a few seconds before the cold, hard logic of Subject 4 took over. They wanted the source code. That meant they needed me alive. They needed me compliant. But they had made a fatal error. They assumed I was still operating on the logic of a desperate father. They didn't realize I was operating on the logic of a risk assessor who had just realized the game was rigged. I didn't have the source code. It was on a server at Vanguard Trust in San Francisco. I couldn't get it. But they didn't know that. They thought I had a copy. Or they thought I could recreate it. I needed leverage. I needed a weapon that wasn't a gun. I picked up the file I had stolen from the bunker. Elena's file. I turned to the back to the section on emergency contacts. Martha had listed a name. Asset Elias Thorne. Status retired/disavowed. Location Burlington, Vermont. Note former cleaner for the agency. Loyal to Martha. Hates the council. I checked the time. It was 8 in the evening. Burlington was an hour away. I put the car in gear and drove. I didn't drive like a fugitive. I drove like a man on a mission. Elias Thorne lived in a dilapidated boat repair shop on the edge of Lake Champlain. When I pulled up, the place looked deserted. I banged on the metal door. "Go away," a voice grumbled from inside. "We are closed." "I am Martha's grandson," I shouted. "Subject 4. The door flew open. A man stood there holding a shotgun. He was 70 years old, with skin like leather and eyes that looked like they had seen the end of the world twice. He looked me up and down. "You look like hell, kid," he said. "Martha said you might show up one day. I didn't think you'd be this ugly." "I need your help," I said. "They have my kids." Elias lowered the shotgun. "Come in." Inside, the shop was a chaotic mix of boat engines and surveillance equipment. Elias poured me a cup of black coffee that tasted like motor oil. I told him everything. The bunker, the video, Elena, the gatekeeper. When I finished, Elias sat back and lit a cigar. So they want the algorithm. And if you don't give it to them, they turn your kids into vegetables. I don't have the algorithm, I admitted. It's in San Francisco. I can't get there and back in 24 hours. So you have to bluff, Elias said. You have to make them think you have it. And you have to lure them into a kill box. The cabin, I said. They want me to meet them at the cabin. The cabin is compromised. Elias shook his head. They have eyes on it, satellites, snipers. If you walk in there, they will tranquilize you, bag you, and take the code from your brain while you are strapped to a table. I know, I said. That is why I am not going to walk in alone, and I am not going to walk in unarmed. I looked at Elias. You were a cleaner. Do you have explosives? Elias grinned, exposing yellow teeth. Kid, asking me if I have explosives is like asking a fish if it has water. We spent the next 6 hours formulating a plan. It was a high-risk scenario. The probability of success was less than 30%, but it was the only shot I had. I needed to draw Elena out. I needed to know where she stood. If she was truly a traitor to the council, she was the key to saving Julian and Skylar. If she was loyal to them, well, then she would die with them. I used the satellite phone to send a text message to the number the gatekeeper had called from. I have the code, but I will only deliver it to Agent 794. Alone. At the cabin. Noon tomorrow. If I see anyone else, I delete the key. It was a gamble. I was betting that their desire for the source code outweighed their distrust of me. I was betting that they would send Elena because they thought she could still manipulate me. The reply came 3 minutes later. Agreed. I looked at Elias. He was wiring a brick of C4 to a remote detonator. Are you ready to play God, kid? He asked. No, I said, checking the magazine of my pistol. I'm ready to play the devil. We arrived back at the woods near the cabin at 4 in the morning. The snow was falling heavily now, a white curtain that obscured vision and muffled sound. It was perfect. We moved through the trees like ghosts. Elias was surprisingly agile for an old man. We skirted the perimeter, using thermal scopes he had provided to spot the council's sentries. There were 4 of them. 2 in the trees, 2 on the roof. We don't kill them yet, Elias whispered. We wait for the main event. We approached the ravine tunnel exit, the one I had crawled out of. Elias set up a tripwire perimeter around the extraction point. Then he handed me a small earpiece. I will be in the sniper nest on the ridge, he said. I can see the front door and the living room window. If things go south, you give the signal. I blow the propane tank behind the house. It will create a distraction. You grab the wife, and you run. And the kids, I asked. If the wife is on our side, she knows where they are, Elias said. If she isn't, then you beat it out of her. I nodded. It was grim. It was brutal. It was necessary. I crawled back into the tunnel. The air was still foul, but this time, I wasn't fleeing. I was infiltrating. I reached the hatch under the living room floor. I could hear movement above me. I waited. Hours passed, my legs cramped. The cold seeped into my bones. Finally, the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed noon. I heard the front door open. He is not here, a male voice said. One of the guards. He will be, a female voice replied. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was her. It was Elena. Leave us, she commanded. Ma'am, protocol dictates we stay. Protocol dictates you secure the source code, she snapped. Her voice was icy, authoritative. The voice of a level 5 administrator. Subject 4 is volatile. If he sees you, he destroys the asset. Get out. Wait by the perimeter. There was a pause, then the sound of boots retreating. The door closed. Silence. I waited 1 minute, 2 minutes. I pushed the release button on the hatch. The hydraulic hiss was loud in the quiet room. I climbed up, gun raised. Elena was standing by the fireplace. She was wearing a white winter coat that made her look like an ice queen. She wasn't looking at the door. She was looking right at the hole in the floor I had just emerged from. She didn't look surprised. She held her hands up, palms open. She was unarmed. "Hello, Christopher," she said softly. I aimed the gun at her chest. My hand didn't shake. "Where are they, Elena?" She looked at the gun, then up at my eyes. There was sadness there. Deep, profound sadness. "They are in a van 2 miles down the road," she said. "They are safe, for now." "You are lying," I spat. "You are the shepherd. You are the administrator. I read your file." "I know you did," she said. "I left it there for you to find." "Why?" I demanded. "So I would know how much of a fool I was. So I would know that our 20 years together was a job." "So you would hate me," she said. Her voice cracked. "Because if you hate me, you can do what needs to be done. You can sacrifice me to save them." I paused, the gun still trained on her heart. "What are you talking about?" "The gatekeeper is watching," she whispered, tapping her ear. She was wearing a wire. "He is listening to everything. I have to play the part, and so do you." She took a step toward me. "Shoot me in the leg, Chris," she mouthed silently, her lips forming the words with exaggerated precision. I stared at her. She was crazy. "Do it!" she screamed aloud, her voice changing to a tone of panic for the benefit of the microphone. "Christopher, put the gun down. You don't want to do this." "Give me the code," I shouted back, playing along, my mind racing. "Shoot me," she mouthed, again tears spilling from her eyes. "It brings them in. It's the only way to get the van here." I understood. If I shot her, the guards would rush in. The van with the kids would be brought closer to secure the extraction of the injured administrator. It was a trap within a trap. I tightened my grip on the trigger. I had never shot a human being. I had never hurt anyone. But this was the woman who had sold my soul. And this was the woman who was trying to buy it back. "I loved you," I said, and this time I wasn't acting. "I really loved you." "I know," she sobbed. "I'm sorry." I lowered the aim by 6 inches. Bang! The sound of the gunshot was deafening in the small cabin. Elena screamed and collapsed to the floor, clutching her thigh. Blood bloomed on the white wool of her coat, like a poppy opening in the snow. "Officer down," she screamed into her lapel mic. "He shot me, move in, move in." I heard shouts from outside, the sound of engines roaring to life. "Elias," I said into my earpiece. "Party time." "Copy that," the old man's voice crackled. "Let it rain." The front door exploded inward as the first wave of mercenaries breached the room. I dove behind the heavy oak sofa just as the world turned into fire and noise. The battle for my family had begun. The blizzard outside had transformed the world into a churning white void. The wind howled against the timber walls of the cabin, a feral sound that vibrated through the floorboards and into the soles of my shoes. It was the kind of storm that erased geography, burying roads and landmarks, until the only thing that existed was this house, and the violence about to unfold inside it. The front door, which I had unlocked moments before, swung open. It didn't bang against the wall. The wind caught it and slammed it hard enough to crack the plaster. Snow swirled into the living room instantly, lowering the temperature by 20 degrees. Elena stepped over the threshold. She was still clutching her thigh where I had shot her, the blood, bright red, against her white coat. But she walked with a terrifying stoic grace. Flanking her were 2 men. They wore expensive charcoal suits and trench coats that looked ridiculous in the Vermont wilderness. They carried leather briefcases, but the way they scanned the room, eyes moving in grids, hands hovering near their waistbands, screamed military training, not law school. "Close the door," one of the men barked. He was tall, with a face that looked like it had been pressed out of sheet metal. "It is freezing." I stood behind the heavy oak sofa, my pistol leveled at them. "Stay where you are," I shouted over the wind. Kick the door shut, slowly. The second man, shorter but broader, kicked the door with his heel. The latch clicked, cutting off the howl of the storm, leaving us in a heavy, suffocating silence. "Mr. Williams," the tall man, said, his voice smooth and professional. "I am Mr. Sterling. This is Mr. Graves. We are legal counsel for the Vanguard Trust. We are here to facilitate the transfer of the intellectual property you stole." "Cut the act," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding my veins. "Lawyers don't carry suppressed Sig Sauers under their coats. And lawyers don't work for the council." Sterling smiled a thin, predatory expression. "We prefer to call it the board. But semantics are irrelevant. You have something of ours. We have something of yours. Your wife tells us you are ready to negotiate." I looked at Elena. She had collapsed into an armchair near the fire, her face pale sweat beading on her forehead. She was breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. "I asked you a question before you brought these vultures in here," I said, keeping my eyes on the men but addressing her. 20 years, Elena. Was any of it real, or was it all just billable hours?" Elena looked up. Her eyes were glassy with pain, but the cold, calculating mask of Agent 794 was gone. In its place was something raw and broken. "It started as a job," she whispered. Her voice was weak, barely audible across the room. "They told me you were dangerous. They told me you were a genetic anomaly that needed containment. I was 19. I believed them. I believed." "Stop talking, Elena," Sterling warned, his hand drifting toward his lapel. She ignored him. She looked straight at me, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that burned. "But then, I watched you hold Julian for the first time. I watched you teach Skylar how to tie her shoes. I watched you cry when your grandmother died. Monsters don't cry, Christopher. You were the most human man I had ever known." "Then why did you destroy me?" I screamed, the betrayal tearing at my throat. "You took my money. You took my reputation. You took my children." "Because I had to make you worthless," she screamed back, the effort causing her to double over in pain. "The council wanted to harvest you, Chris. They wanted to plug you into the mainframe and drain your mind until you were a vegetable. The only way to save you was to make them think you were broken, unstable. A liability." I froze. The logic hit me like a physical blow. It was a risk assessment strategy. If an asset becomes too volatile, you liquidate it, or you write it down. By framing me as a violent, mentally ill criminal, she was trying to depreciate my value to zero, so the council would cut their losses and leave me alone. "I stripped you of everything, so you would have no choice but to run," she sobbed. "I needed you to run before the extraction team arrived. I needed you to find the bunker. I needed you to wake up." Sterling pulled a gun from his holster. The pretense was over. "That is enough. Secure the target. Eliminate the traitor." "No," I shouted. Sterling turned his weapon toward Elena. I didn't think, I reacted. But I didn't shoot. I knew that in a firefight against 2 trained assassins I would lose. I had to use the environment. I had to use the house. I stomped my foot on a specific floorboard behind the sofa. Martha had shown me this trigger when I was 10 years old, disguising it as a magic trick. It wasn't magic. It was a mechanical release for the counterweight system of the heavy iron chandelier hanging directly above the fireplace. Clang. The iron chain snapped. The massive chandelier, weighing 300 pounds of wrought iron and staghorns, plummeted from the cathedral ceiling. It didn't hit the men directly, but it crashed into the coffee table between them and Elena with the force of a bomb. Wood splintered. Glass exploded. The floor shook violently. Sterling and Graves dived in opposite directions to avoid the shrapnel. "Run, Chris!" Elena screamed. "Get to the kitchen!" I didn't argue. I sprinted toward the hallway, grabbing a heavy vase from the side table and hurling it at the light switch on the wall. The vase shattered, smashing the switch plate and plunging the room into semi-darkness, illuminated only by the dying fire. "Target is mobile," Graves shouted. I heard the thwip-thwip of suppressed gunfire. Bullets chewed into the doorframe inches from my head as I dove into the kitchen. I scrambled across the linoleum floor, my mind racing. I was in the kitchen. They were in the living room. There were two of them, one of me, plus Elena, who was bleeding out. I needed to separate them. The cabin was a maze of renovations Martha had done over 40 years. It wasn't just a house. It was a panic room disguised as a rustic retreat. I crawled to the pantry. Inside, on the bottom shelf behind the canned peaches, was a liver painted red. Martha had called it the pest control switch. It controlled the emergency shutters. I yanked the lever down. A loud hydraulic grinding noise echoed through the house. Heavy steel shutters slammed down over every window, and door on the ground floor sealing us inside a metal box. The sound was deafening, disorienting. "He locked us in," Sterling yelled from the living room. "Switch to thermal, flush him out." I knew they would have night vision. I had to blind them. I grabbed a bag of flour from the counter and a bottle of high-proof rum from the liquor cabinet. It was a crude tactic, but it was all I had. I waited by the kitchen doorway. I could hear their footsteps, soft, professional. They were splitting up. One coming down the hall, one circling through the dining room. I tossed the bag of flour into the hallway and fired a single shot into it. The bag exploded, filling the narrow corridor with a thick, white cloud of particulate matter. "Contact front!" Graves shouted, firing blindly into the cloud. The flour did two things. It obscured their vision, rendering their thermal scopes useless, because the floating particles reflected the heat. And it was flammable. I lit a rag stuffed into the neck of the rum bottle and hurled it into the cloud. Whoosh! A fireball erupted in the hallway. It wasn't a lethal explosion, but the sudden flash of heat and light was blinding in the dark house. Graves screamed, stumbling back, swatting at his singed coat. I didn't wait to see the damage. I turned and ran toward the back stairs. I needed to get to the second floor, the high ground. "He is heading upstairs," Sterling yelled. He was calm, too calm. He hadn't been caught in the blast. I took the stairs two at a time, my lungs burning. I reached the landing and kicked open the door to the master bedroom. I ran to the far wall where an old dumbwaiter shaft connected the bedroom to the basement. I wasn't going to use it to escape. I was going to use it to hunt. I heard Sterling pounding up the stairs. He was fast. I wedged a chair under the doorknob of the bedroom and backed away. I looked around the room. Martha's bedroom, the heavy oak wardrobe, the antique vanity, and the floor. The floor in this room was rigged. Martha had been paranoid about someone coming up the stairs while she slept. I moved to the center of the room, standing on the rug. I waited. Bang! The doorknob shattered. The door flew open. Sterling stood there, his silhouette framed by the hallway light. He raised his weapon. "End of the line, Mr. Williams," he said. "Give me the code and I will make it quick." "The code is 000, I said, my voice trembling. "What?" 0 seconds, I said. I shifted my weight to my heels and stomped hard on the center medallion of the rug. The floor beneath Sterling gave way. It wasn't a trapdoor. It was a breakaway section of the floor joists held in place by magnetic pins that disengaged with pressure release. Martha had designed it to drop an intruder into the linen closet on the first floor. Sterling fell with a shout of surprise, his gun firing harmlessly into the ceiling. He crashed through the plaster and lathed below, landing with a sickening thud in a pile of towels and sheets. I didn't check on him. I knew Graves was still active. I ran out of the bedroom and to the balcony that overlooked the living room. Below me, the living room was a wreck. The chandelier lay twisted on the floor. The fire was dying. Elena was still in the armchair, but she had pulled herself up. She was holding Sterling's gun, the one he had dropped when the chandelier hit. Graves was stalking toward her, his back to me. He was limping, his face burned from the flour explosion. "You stupid bitch," Graves growled, raising his weapon. "You think you can save him. He is a product. He has an expiration date. "Hey!" I shouted from the balcony. Graves spun around, aiming up at me. I didn't have a clear shot, but I had one last card to play. On the wall next to me was the thermostat. But it wasn't a normal thermostat. It was connected to the Halon fire suppression system Martha had installed for her library. I smashed the plastic casing and ripped the wires out, twisting them together. A high-pitched siren wailed. Hiss. Jets of halon gas sprayed from nozzles in the ceiling of the living room. Halon sucks the oxygen out of the air to starve a fire. It also starves people. Graves choked, grabbing his throat. He tried to aim, but his vision was swimming. He staggered back, gasping for air that wasn't there. "Christopher," Elena gasped. She was lower to the ground where the oxygen was still lingering, but she was fading fast. "I had to get down there. I vaulted over the railing, dropping 12 feet to the living room floor. I landed hard, rolling to absorb the impact." Graves was on his knees, clawing at his chest. I walked up to him and kicked the gun out of his hand. I hit him across the face with the butt of my pistol, knocking him unconscious. I ran to Elena. I scooped her up in my arms. She was light, too light. Her skin was freezing. "Hold on," I said, dragging her toward the kitchen. The kitchen was on a separate ventilation loop. The Halon hadn't reached it yet. I kicked the kitchen door shut behind us and laid her on the table. "Chris," she wheezed, clutching my jacket. "The van. The kids, you have to go." "I'm not leaving you," I said, pressing a dish towel against the wound in her leg. The bleeding had slowed, but she had lost a lot. "You have to," she whispered. "Sterling, he is not dead. He is enhanced. Like you. But physical. He will get out of that closet." "Enhanced." I froze. "Subject 7, she said, her eyes fluttering closed. "Military application, high pain tolerance, accelerated healing. He is coming." As if on cue, a fist punched through the drywall of the kitchen pantry. Then another. Sterling was tearing through the wall from the laundry room. I could hear him grunting a low, animalistic sound. He wasn't human. He was a machine made of meat and rage. I looked at the back door. It was sealed by the steel shutters. The control lever was jammed. We were trapped in the kitchen with a monster clawing his way in. I looked at Elena. She smiled, a sad, bloody smile. "The basement," she whispered. "The dumbwaiter, it goes down to the tunnel." I looked at the dumbwaiter door in the corner of the kitchen. It was small, big enough for a person if they curled up. "You go," I said. "No," she shook her head. "I can't crawl. You go, save the kids." "I am not leaving you," I roared. I grabbed her and shoved her into the dumbwaiter box. She screamed in pain as her leg twisted, but I forced the door shut. "I will meet you at the tunnel exit," I yelled. "Go!" I hit the down button. The motor whirred and the box descended into the darkness. I was alone in the kitchen. The wall exploded inward. Sterling stepped through the debris. He was covered in plaster dust, his nose was broken, and his suit was shredded. But he didn't look injured. He looked annoyed. He cracked his neck. "Mr. Williams, you have caused a significant amount of property damage." I raised my gun and fired. 3 shots. Center mass. Sterling stumbled back, but he didn't fall. He looked down at the holes in his chest, then back at me. He smiled. "Kevlar weave implants," he said. "Subdermal." He charged. I didn't have time to reload. I didn't have time to think. I threw the gun at his face and grabbed the only thing left on the counter. A cast-iron skillet. It was ridiculous. It was comical. But it was heavy. Sterling swung a fist that would have taken my head off. I ducked, feeling the wind of the blow ruffle my hair. I swung the skillet with both hands, putting every ounce of my genetically engineered leverage into the strike. Clang! The pan connected with his knee. I heard a snap. Sterling roared, dropping to one knee. Even enhanced bones break if you hit them hard enough with iron. I didn't stop. I swung again, aiming for the temple. Crack! He went down. I stood over him, panting, the skillet vibrating in my hands. "Assess that risk," I spat. I turned and ran for the dumbwaiter shaft. I didn't have the box, so I grabbed the cables and slid down into the darkness, the friction burning my palms, sliding toward the underworld to reclaim my wife and save my children. The house had done its job. Now it was my turn. The friction burns on my palms were screaming as I hit the dirt floor of the tunnel, but pain was a distant signal I chose to ignore. I scrambled to my feet in the pitch, black, guided only by the faint light filtering down from the dumbwaiter shaft above. Elena was there, leaning against the damp earth wall, clutching her bleeding leg. Her face was a mask of agony, but her eyes were alive. "The van!" she gasped. "2 miles east, logging road marker 4. "I know," I said, wrapping my arm around her waist to support her weight. "Elias is already there." We moved through the tunnel like rats, fleeing a sinking ship. Above us I heard the muffled thud of Sterling's body hitting the kitchen floor, followed by the angry roar of a man who had been bested by a frying pan. He would be coming, but he was too late. We burst out of the tunnel exit into the blinding white of the blizzard. The cold was a physical assault, but through the swirling snow, I saw the most beautiful sight of my life. A battered black van was idling near the tree line, and Elias Thorne was standing by the open sliding door, a cigar clamped between his teeth and an assault rifle in his hands. Inside the van, huddled under heavy blankets, were Julian and Skylar. "Dad!" Skylar screamed as I climbed in, dragging Elena with me. I didn't have words. I just pulled them into a crush of wet wool and tears checking their faces, their hands making sure they were whole. Julian looked terrified. Skylar was shaking, but they were alive. They were mine. "Go!" I shouted to Elias. "Drive!" The van tore through the snowdrifts, fishtailing onto the main road. We didn't stop driving for 6 hours. We crossed state lines, switching vehicles twice at safe houses Elias had maintained since the Cold War. By the time we settled in a nondescript motel on the outskirts of Boston, the sun was rising on a new world. But I knew running wasn't enough. The council had satellites. They had infinite resources. If we just ran, we would spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders, waiting for the bullet. I looked at the canvas bag of money sitting on the motel bed. $1 million in cold, hard cash. And next to it, the files from the bunker. "We don't hide," I said, turning to Elena, who was letting Elias stitch up her leg with a grim efficiency. "We attack." "We can't fight them physically, Chris." Elena winced. "Sterling was just the infantry. The council has armies." "I know," I said, opening the laptop Elias had procured. "So, we use the one weapon they can't shoot, the truth, and the law. I didn't use the money to buy guns. I used it to buy the sharks that swim in the same waters as the council. I spent $300,000 in a single morning retaining a team of high-profile defense attorneys and forensic investigators, all hired through blind trusts and shell companies. So they didn't know who their client was, only that the check cleared. Then I initiated the leak. I didn't just dump the files on the internet where they could be scrubbed by the council's algorithms. I used a dead man's switch protocol I had designed at Vanguard. I sent encrypted keys to the editors-in-chief of the 3 largest independent investigative newspapers in America, along with a snippet of the data, the financial ties between Vanguard Trust and illegal arms proliferation in the Middle East. The subject line was simple Project Heritage. The receipt. 24 hours later, the world exploded. The headlines were not just big, they were cataclysmic. Vanguard Trust linked to human experimentation ring. Shadow banking. Scandal exposes $1 trillion black budget. The council relied on secrecy. They were a fungus that grew in the dark. I had just turned on the sun. While the media circus was burning down their public image, I went for the jugular. I sat at the wobbly desk in the motel room, surrounded by the yellowed documents I had salvaged from Martha's basement. These weren't just old records. They were a roadmap of the Council's financial architecture from the 1980s. They thought they had modernized, but I knew how these institutions worked. They never closed the old accounts. They just built on top of them. I found the routing numbers for their offshore holding companies in the Cayman Islands and Liechtenstein. I found the source code they were so desperate for, not a magical algorithm, but the knowledge of where their bodies were buried. I didn't steal their money. That would be theft. Instead, I used my credentials, which Vanguard hadn't been able to fully revoke yet, because of the chaos, to trigger a massive, automated audit of those specific shell accounts. I flagged them for terrorist financing violations with the International Monetary Fund. It was a bureaucratic nuclear strike. Within 4 hours, assets totaling over $40 billion were frozen by international banking regulators. The Council wasn't just exposed. They were broke. Or at least their liquidity was gone. They couldn't pay their mercenaries. They couldn't bribe judges. They were paralyzed. But the final nail in the coffin was Elena. She walked into the federal building in Boston, not as a prisoner, but as a whistleblower. With the high-priced legal team flanking her, she laid out the entire scheme. She admitted to forging the money laundering evidence against me. She admitted to the surveillance, but she framed it perfectly. She was an employee acting under duress, threatened with the death of her children by rogue executives at Vanguard Trust. She became the Crown witness. The Department of Justice, sensing the biggest corporate RICO case in history, offered her full immunity in exchange for the names of the Council members. She gave them everything: senatorial backers, defense contractors, the men who had stood in my living room. Vanguard Trust didn't just fall, it disintegrated. The stock price went to zero in a single trading session. However, I knew that a wounded animal is the most dangerous. The Council was destroyed as an organization, but the individuals, the powerful men and women facing life in prison, would want revenge. They would want to silence the loose ends. We needed one last deception. I met with the lead FBI agent, a man named Henderson who looked like he hadn't slept in a week. "You are high-value targets," Henderson said. "Even in prison, these men have reach. We can put you in witness protection, but as long as Christopher Williams and his family are alive on paper, there will be a bounty on your heads." "I know," I said. "That is why Christopher Williams has to die." We orchestrated it carefully. The FBI leaked a story that our safe house location had been compromised. They staged a high-speed transport along a coastal highway in Maine. On a rainy Tuesday night, a black SUV carrying the family swerved off a cliff and exploded in a massive fireball before sinking into the Atlantic Ocean. The media reported it as a tragic accident, possibly a final hit by the crumbling syndicate. The bodies were never recovered due to the intense heat and dangerous currents, but dental records conveniently planted by the Bureau confirmed the identities. Christopher Elena Julian and Skylar Williams were officially declared dead. 2 weeks later, I sat in a small, sun-drenched kitchen in a town that didn't appear on most maps. It was quiet. The only sound was Skylar practicing her violin in the living room, and Julian laughing at something on the television. Elena walked in, placing a cup of coffee in front of me. She walked with a cane, now a permanent reminder of the night in the cabin, but she looked younger, lighter. The weight of Agent 794 was gone. "It is done," she said softly. "The money?" I asked. "Transferred," she nodded. "Every cent, $5.2 million. We had made a decision. We couldn't keep the money from the sale of the Silicon Valley house. It was blood money. It was part of the life that had been a lie." Elena had directed the FBI to liquidate the frozen assets and donate the entire sum, $5.2 million, to a global charity for victims of human trafficking and institutional abuse. It was our penance. It was our way of washing the slate clean. I took a sip of the coffee. It was cheap instant coffee, not the artisan blend I used to drink in San Francisco. It tasted like freedom. "So," I said, looking out the window at the rolling hills of our new home in Montana. "Who are we today?" Elena smiled. She reached across the table and took my hand. Her grip was warm, real. No more gloves. No more secrets. "I am Sarah," she said. "And you are Michael." "Michael Roach." I laughed. It was one of the names from the passports in the safe. Michael Roach, I tested the name. High school history teacher. Terrible at math. Hates spreadsheets. "And loves his wife," she added, squeezing my hand. "And loves his wife?" I agreed. The council was gone. The nightmare was over. I had lost my name, my career, and my fortune. I was a ghost in the system, a man who technically didn't exist. But as I looked at my wife and listened to my children, I realized the risk assessment I had made in the basement was the only one that mattered. I had bet everything on the truth. And for the first time in 45 years, the return on investment was infinite. The Atlantic Ocean crashed against the jagged rocks of the Maine coastline, sending sprays of freezing mist into the gray morning air. It was a different kind of cold than Vermont. In Vermont, the cold was still and silent, trapped between the trees. Here, on the edge of the world, the cold was alive. It roared and bit and cleansed. I pulled the collar of my heavy wool coat up around my neck and watched the two figures running along the shoreline. Julian and Skylar were chasing a golden retriever we had adopted from a shelter 3 weeks ago. They were laughing. The sound was snatched away by the wind almost instantly, but I could see it in their posture. Their shoulders were loose. The hunch of fear that had defined their last months in San Francisco was gone. They were not Julian and Skylar Williams anymore. They were Jack and Emma Roach. And I was Michael Roach, a freelance data consultant, living in a weathered shingle house at the end of a dirt road that Google Maps barely recognized. Elena sat beside me on a piece of driftwood that had been bleached white by the sun and salt. She was staring at the horizon, her profile sharp against the slate gray sky. She looked different. The severe bun was gone, replaced by loose, wind-tangled hair. The designer clothes were replaced by jeans and a thick fisherman's sweater. But it was her eyes that had changed the most. The calculator behind them was broken. There was no more assessing, no more manipulating. Just a quiet, profound peace. "Do you think they are happy?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the surf. "I think they are free," I replied. "Which is better than happy." "And us?" She turned to look at me. "Are we free, Chris, or are we just hiding?" "We are ghosts, Sarah," I said, using her new name. "Ghosts cannot be caught. Ghosts cannot be hurt." She smiled, but it was a sad smile. "Ghosts also do not exist. Sometimes I feel like I'm fading away, like Elena Williams was the only real thing, even if she was a lie." I reached into the deep pocket of my coat. My fingers brushed against the rough wood of a small box. It was the final item I had taken from the bunker in Vermont. I had grabbed it from the shelf right before I crawled into the tunnel, almost as an afterthought. It was a simple cigar box taped shut with no label. I had carried it with me through the blizzard, through the escape van, through the motel rooms, and all the way to this beach. I hadn't opened it. I think a part of me was afraid that if I opened it, it would contain one last horror. One last instruction from Martha that would shatter this fragile piece we had built. But today felt like the day. The sky was heavy with the promise of a storm, and the air felt charged with finality. "I have something," I said, pulling the box out. Elena stiffened. Her eyes dropped to the box, and I saw a flicker of the old fear. "What is that?" "It is from Martha," I said. "From the bunker. I haven't opened it." Elena pulled her knees to her chest. "Burn it," she whispered. "Throw it in the ocean. We don't need any more truth. We have had enough truth to last a lifetime." "I can't," I said. "She left it for a reason. She was the only one who knew the whole board. If we are going to start this new life, we have to know what we are building it on." I used my thumbnail to slice through the old yellowed Scotch tape, sealing the lid. The box creaked as I opened it. It smelled of cedar and thyme. Inside there was no money. There were no tapes. There was just a single piece of paper, folded in thirds, resting on a bed of dried lavender. I took the paper out. My hands were trembling slightly, not from the cold, but from the weight of the moment. I unfolded it. It was a document. An official state document with a raised seal that had faded over the decades. Certificate of live birth. I scanned the name. I expected to see my own name. Or maybe a name I didn't know. But the name typed on the line was Elena Marie Corvus. I frowned. Corvs. That was Elena's maiden name. The name she used when we met in college. The name that was on our marriage license. But then my eyes drifted down to the date of birth. March 3rd, 1982. And below that, the place of birth. It wasn't Chicago, as she had always told me. It wasn't even a hospital. Place of birth Heritage Research Facility, Ward B, Omaha, Nebraska. I felt the world tilt. The sound of the ocean faded into a dull roar in my ears. I read the line again. Heritage Research Facility. I looked at the parents' names. Mother subject, 219. Deceased, father unknown donor/genetic sequence, Alpha 5. I stared at the paper for a long time. The wind whipped the corners, threatening to tear it from my grasp. "What is it?" Elena asked. Her voice was tight with anxiety. Chris, what does it say?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just handed her the paper. She took it. She read it. I watched her face. I watched the color drain from her skin until she was as white as the sea foam crashing on the sand. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She read it again. And again. "No," she whispered. "No. This is fake. This is a forgery." "It has the seal," I said softly. "It is the original. Martha must have stolen it when she stole me." "But Elena's voice shook. "I was recruited. I was 19. They found me at university. They told me I was gifted. They told me I had a high aptitude for psychological manipulation. They hired me. I was an employee. I had a salary. I had a pension plan." She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a horror that went deeper than anything we had faced in the cabin. "I wasn't an employee," she choked out. "I was one of them." "You were Subject 794? I said, the pieces falling into place with a terrifying clarity. "You weren't assigned to me because you were a good agent, Elena. You were bred for me." She dropped the paper onto the sand as if it were burning her. She wrapped her arms around herself, rocking back and forth. "My parents. My mother in Chicago, she is a school teacher. I visit her every Christmas." "Is she," I asked gently, "or is she a handler, like Martha was to me? Did she push you? Did she guide you toward psychology? Did she encourage you to apply for that specific scholarship that put you on the council's radar?" Elena stopped rocking. She stared out at the gray water. Tears streamed down her face, cold and unheeded. She was replaying her entire life, just as I had done in the bunker. She was seeing the strings she thought she was pulling were actually tied to her own wrists. "They made us," she whispered. "Both of us. You were the logic. I was the emotion. You were the structure. I was the chaos. They didn't just want to study us separately. They wanted to see what would happen if they crashed us together. They wanted to breed the next generation," I said, looking down the beach at Julian and Skylar. "They wanted the synthesis. That is why they needed us to marry. That is why they needed us to have children. It wasn't just a cover story, Elena. It was the experiment." She let out a sob that sounded like something breaking. "Then it was all fake. Everything. The day we met, the day we got married. The way I felt I thought I was breaking the rules by falling in love with you. I thought I was rebelling. But even my rebellion was programmed. Even my love was just genetic compatibility. She buried her face in her hands. I am nothing. I am just a petri dish with a name. I looked at her. I looked at the woman who had destroyed my life to save it. I looked at the woman who had taken a bullet for me. I looked at the woman who was currently sitting on a freezing beach in Maine with a new name and no past. I reached out and picked up the birth certificate from the sand. I folded it carefully and put it back in the box. Then I took the box and threw it as hard as I could into the ocean. It landed in the surf, bobbing for a second before a wave crashed over it, dragging it down into the dark, cold depths. Chris, Elena looked up startled. It doesn't matter, I said. How can you say that? She cried. It means we are monsters. It means we are puppets. No, I said firmly. I grabbed her shoulders and turned her to face me. Listen to me. They designed the car. They built the engine. They poured the fuel. But they didn't drive it. I pointed at the spot where the box had disappeared. They designed you to manipulate me. They designed me to analyze you. They put us in a cage and waited for us to breed. But do you know what they didn't account for? They didn't account for the fact that I would forgive you. They didn't account for the fact that you would sacrifice yourself for me. That wasn't programming, Elena. That was choice. I wiped a tear from her cheek with my thumb. The Council deals in data. They deal in predictability. But what you did in that cabin, betraying your masters, throwing away your life, taking a bullet that was irrational, that was statistically impossible for a self-preserving organism. That wasn't genetics. That was love. Elena stared at me, her breath hitching. You think it's real. I think it is the only thing that is real, I said. We found each other in a maze designed to keep us lost. We found a way to be human in a world that wanted us to be machines. And look at the result. I pointed down the beach again. The dog was barking, splashing in the shallow water. Julian was throwing a stick, his arm strong and sure. Skylar was laughing, her hair whipping in the wind, her face bright with joy. Look at them, I said. They are not Subject 5 and Subject 6. They are not the sum of our damaged DNA. They are happy. They are kind. They are ours. Elena looked at the children. Slowly, the tension left her body. She leaned her head against my shoulder. We beat them, she whispered. We didn't just beat them, I said, wrapping my arm around her. We outlived them. The Council is dead. The experiment is over. The lab is closed. I looked out at the vast, endless ocean. The water was gray and cold, but it was also open. It went on forever. I promise you, I said, my voice, low and fierce, a vow made to the wind and the sea. I will never let them be pawns. I will never let anyone use them. They will be ordinary. They will be boring. They will make mistakes and have bad jobs and fall in love with people who aren't pre-selected for them. They will be the one thing we never were allowed to be. What is that? Elena asked. Free, I said. We sat there for a long time watching the tide come in. We were two broken products of a dead system, stranded on the edge of the continent. We had no money to our real names. We had no history that wasn't a lie. We had scars on our bodies and holes in our memories. But as I sat there, holding the hand of the woman who was both my nemesis and my savior, I felt a strange heavy weight lift from my chest. I realized that for 45 years, I had been hoarding assets. I had been accumulating status, money, reputation, trying to build a fortress to keep myself safe. I thought that was what it meant to be a man. I thought that was what it meant to be successful. But the fortress was a prison, and the assets were chains. I looked at my wife. I looked at my children. I took a deep breath of the freezing, salty air. I had nothing, and because I had nothing, I had everything. Sometimes, to find the truth, you have to lose everything you thought you owned. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from. I would love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Calm Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and smash that hype button so this story can reach even more people.